Callista Mercer sat in the dim light of her cramped Atlanta apartment, her eyes fixed on the faded ceiling as rain tapped insistently against the window. Every day had become a struggle, a battle against mounting debts that clawed at her every waking moment, a relentless pressure that threatened to snuff out the fragile dreams she once held dear as an aspiring artist. The peeling wallpaper and the sound of distant city traffic were constant reminders of a life filled with hardship and sacrifice. On this particularly dreary evening, as the clock ticked past midnight and her weary hands sorted through overdue bills and eviction notices, an unexpected knock shattered the silence. Startled, Callista rose from her threadbare sofa and hesitantly moved toward the door. The corridor beyond was narrow and poorly lit, and each step echoed with the uncertainty of a future she could barely imagine. When she finally opened the door, she was met by a vision that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Standing on the threshold was a man whose presence was as commanding as it was unsettling. His tailored suit was immaculate, a stark contrast to her worn-out attire, and his dark eyes glinted with an intensity that both intimidated and fascinated her. "Good evening, Miss Mercer," he said in a voice that was smooth, cool, and laced with an edge of authority. "I'm Blaze Hawthorne." Blaze's tone left no room for ambiguity. There was a cold, deliberate quality in his words that hinted at the power he wielded in the world of high finance. Before Callista could muster a proper greeting, he continued, "I have an offer for you, a proposition that might very well change your life." For a moment, time seemed to slow. Callista's heart pounded as she searched his face for clues. Was he a savior or a predator? The man before her exuded both wealth and ruthlessness, and his gaze, though inscrutable, carried a promise of escape from the crushing burden of her debts. Blaze stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "I know you're drowning in debt, and I know you have dreams that have been deferred for far too long. I can pay off every last cent you owe, clear your name, and give you a fresh start." His words, precise and rehearsed, sent a shiver down her spine. "But there is a condition," he added, pausing for effect as if weighing the gravity of what he was about to propose. "I want a baby, a child born from our union. In exchange, I will free you from your financial chains." Callista's mind raced as his proposition settled over her like an icy fog. The very idea was outrageous, a bargain that defied the natural order of things and struck her as something out of a twisted fairy tale. Yet, in that moment, the relentless pressure of her mounting debts and the gnawing fear of losing her modest art studio left her feeling cornered and desperate. The offer, as abhorrent as it seemed, promised an immediate reprieve from a future that appeared increasingly bleak. With trembling fingers and a racing heart, she listened as Blaze continued, his tone unexpectedly softening when he spoke of his own past, a story of loss, isolation, and the burden of unrelenting ambition. "I'm not a man who usually makes such unconventional proposals," Blaze admitted, his eyes briefly betraying a vulnerability that was startling in its rarity. "But I've built my empire on the back of cold logic and merciless decisions. Sometimes, though, even a man like me recognizes that a life lived without genuine connection is a life half-lived. I've been offered so much by the world of business, yet I find myself yearning for something real, a legacy that isn't measured solely in dollars and balance sheets." His gaze bore into hers, as though he were searching for a spark of understanding. "Callista, I'm offering you a way out, a chance to reclaim your future, to live without the constant shadow of debt. And perhaps, in return, we might create something beautiful together." The air between them seemed to crackle with the tension of an impossible decision. Callista's mind was a tumult of emotions, fear, anger, desperation, and a faint, unexpected flicker of hope. She could hardly believe that a man of Blaze's stature would descend from his ivory tower to present such a proposition to someone like her. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that no amount of debt relief could justify the cost of surrendering such a personal part of herself. And yet, as she looked into Blaze's intense, unwavering eyes, she sensed that there was something more behind his words, a promise, perhaps, of an escape from the despair that had defined her existence for so long. After a long, agonizing pause that felt like an eternity, Callista's resolve wavered under the crushing weight of her circumstances. With a trembling sigh and tears threatening to spill over, she found herself uttering a single, shuddering yes. In that instant, the deal was sealed, not with the flourish of a contract, but with the quiet desperation of two souls reaching out in the dark for a chance at redemption. Outside, the rain continued to fall, each drop a reminder of the harsh reality that Callista was leaving behind, and the uncertain promise of a future that might, against all odds, be transformed by the unlikeliest of bargains. As Blaze extended his hand, Callista hesitated only a moment longer before taking it, the cool touch of his skin sending a cascade of conflicting sensations through her. In that charged moment, as the storm raged on and the city lights flickered in the distance, her life was irrevocably altered, a life no longer defined solely by debt and despair, but by the bold, terrifying hope of a new beginning. Callista awoke the next morning to a dismal, overcast sky that mirrored the storm of thoughts raging within her. The heavy patter of rain on her apartment window, still damp from the night's downpour, set a mournful rhythm that seemed to underscore the gravity of her decision. Every detail of that fateful evening played on an endless loop in her mind: Blaze Hawthorne's cold yet compelling gaze, the way his voice had softened as he laid out his extraordinary proposition, and the moment her trembling yes had sealed her fate. Now, in the stark light of dawn, the reality of her choice pressed down on her like the weight of an entire lifetime. In the silence of her modest bedroom, Callista sat on the edge of her worn-out bed and clutched a threadbare journal to her chest. The words she had scribbled in a frantic hand the previous night, fragments of hopes and doubts intermingled with desperate dreams, seemed almost surreal. She read and reread her scrawled confessions, each line a reminder of the impossible bargain she had struck. The offer had been as outrageous as it was devastating, a baby in exchange for the complete erasure of her crushing debt. And yet, in that moment of vulnerability, Blaze had spoken of a future where her financial ruin might be replaced by the promise of a new beginning, a future filled not only with monetary relief but also with a chance at genuine love. Unable to shake the residual tremors of that night, Callista decided to leave her apartment for a few hours to seek clarity away from the oppressive confines of her memories. Bundling herself in a faded coat and wrapping a scarf tightly around her neck, she stepped out into the drizzly streets of Atlanta. The city, still half asleep and glistening with fresh rain, offered little comfort. Its neon reflections and wet sidewalks seemed to echo the uncertainty that churned within her. Each step felt heavy, as if she were walking toward an unknown destiny that could either redeem her or plunge her further into despair. Her destination was a small, secluded cafe tucked away on a quiet side street, one that she had frequented during better times, when her dreams of becoming a recognized artist still burned bright. The familiar chime of the cafe's doorbell brought a momentary relief as she entered, the warm glow of the interior a stark contrast to the gray, unyielding morning outside. Finding a quiet corner by a rain-streaked window, she ordered a cup of strong coffee and settled into a warm leather armchair. The murmur of quiet conversations, the clink of cups, and the soft jazz playing in the background offered a temporary respite from the tumult in her heart. As she sipped her coffee, Callista's thoughts turned inexorably to Blaze. She recalled the calculated precision in his words, the way he had measured his proposition with both cold logic and an unexpected undercurrent of vulnerability. Despite the cruelty implicit in his offer, there had been a spark of something genuine, a hint that behind the mask of a ruthless billionaire lay a man capable of real emotion. Yet even as she acknowledged that possibility, a gnawing fear persisted: was she being lured into a trap from which there was no escape? Every rational thought urged her to reject the offer outright, to cling to a dignity that she felt slipping away. And yet, the relentless pressure of debt and the bleak prospects of her current life left her with no choice but to consider a future built on an arrangement so unorthodox that it defied all her previous beliefs. Her mind raced through the potential consequences. What would it mean to be bound to a man like Blaze? Was his promise of clearing her debt merely a transaction, or was there an unspoken promise of partnership and protection? The contradictions tormented her. On one hand, the idea of financial freedom, a life free from the constant barrage of creditors and the crushing weight of unpaid bills, sparked a flicker of hope. On the other hand, the thought of surrendering a part of herself, of becoming entwined in a relationship that had begun under such coercive circumstances, filled her with an overwhelming sense of vulnerability and loss of autonomy. In the midst of these spiraling thoughts, Callista pulled out her phone and hesitated before pressing the call button. The number Blaze had given her the previous night still flashed on the screen, a lifeline, perhaps, to further explanation. After a long moment, she pressed call, her finger trembling. The line rang several times before a deep, measured voice answered. "Callista," Blaze said, his tone calm yet imbued with a subtle urgency. "I hope you're well this morning." For a moment, she could barely manage a reply, her throat dry and her heart pounding so violently it felt as if it might shatter. I'm trying to process everything," she managed finally, her voice barely a whisper. Blaze's voice softened further. "I understand," he replied. "Take your time. I know this isn't a decision you can make lightly. I'll call you again later today, and if you have any questions or need clarification, I'm here." The conversation ended, leaving Callista with a hollow mixture of relief and apprehension. She sat back in her chair, staring at the rain-dappled glass as though it held answers. The world outside blurred into a mist of raindrops and neon reflections, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to wonder if perhaps fate had, in its own cruel way, offered her a chance to rewrite her story. That afternoon, as the cafe's lullaby of soft chatter and gentle clinks continued around her, Callista began to jot down her thoughts in a small notebook. Each word was a desperate plea for understanding, a mixture of raw emotion and tentative plans for a future she was too scared to fully embrace. She wrote about the crushing weight of her debts, the desperation that had led her to consider Blaze's outrageous proposal, and the spark of hope that, despite everything, had ignited within her. In between the lines, her writing revealed a deep, unspoken desire not merely for financial liberation but for a life filled with genuine love and connection, a life where the scars of the past could be healed by the promise of a new beginning. As dusk approached and the rain finally subsided, Callista left the cafe with her journal clutched tightly in her arms. The city, still damp and glistening under the glow of streetlights, seemed to hum with a quiet energy, one that promised change, even if it was cloaked in uncertainty. With each step, her mind teemed with questions. Could she truly trust Blaze, a man who had both the power to destroy and the potential to save? Was there a way to disentangle herself from the desperate bargain while embracing the possibility of a future built on something far more profound than mere debt relief? And, most hauntingly, was the spark of love that had flared so unexpectedly merely a trick of desperation, or the genuine beginning of something transformative? By the time Callista returned to her modest studio, her thoughts had crystallized into a fragile resolve. She knew that the day ahead would bring more questions and perhaps more revelations from Blaze, but in the quiet sanctuary of her own creativity, she felt a stirring, a determination to confront the unknown. Whether this new chapter would lead to heartbreak or to a miraculous transformation of her life, she could not escape the truth that something fundamental had shifted. And as she prepared to immerse herself in her art once more, Callista vowed silently that she would explore every possibility, no matter how dangerous or unexpected, in pursuit of a future that promised not just survival, but the chance to love and be loved in return. The first fragile light of dawn crept through the thin curtains of Callista's temporary bridal suite, casting gentle shadows on the ornate, yet cold, furnishings. She awoke with a jolt of awareness that mingled exhilaration with a lingering sense of dread, a disquieting cocktail born of the previous night's tumultuous events. As she slowly gathered her scattered thoughts, memories of that surreal wedding night rose unbidden, the rigid formality that had masked an undercurrent of passion, the cold contractual promises juxtaposed against moments of tender vulnerability, and the way Blaze Hawthorne's touch had both comforted and unsettled her. In those hazy, lingering moments before full consciousness, she recalled the contrast between the clinical recitations of vows and the subtle, almost imperceptible expressions in Blaze's eyes that hinted at a deeper conflict within him. Callista sat up, her hands trembling as she reached for the delicate porcelain cup of tea placed thoughtfully on a side table. The tea steam curled around her face as if trying to whisper reassurance, yet her heart remained a tumult of emotions. Every detail of the previous night, the weight of Blaze's gaze, the fleeting softness in his voice, the hesitant way he had reached out to her, now played back in slow motion. As she dressed, she found herself touching the fabric of her gown with an almost desperate longing, as if the smooth material might somehow remind her of a promise of hope amid despair. Outside, the city was waking up, but the world beyond her window felt distant, remote, a stark contrast to the intimate universe that had been forged in that opulent suite. Across town, Blaze awoke in a spacious, austere penthouse that overlooked a sprawling skyline. His mind, usually as sharp as the tailored lines of his suit, was clouded with memories of the night before. The contract he had so coldly enforced still hung in the back of his thoughts, yet what had transpired between him and Callista, the unguarded moments of vulnerability, the soft exchanges of whispered truths, had appended his usual detachment. As he sat at his mahogany desk, he replayed every gesture and every word that had broken through his carefully maintained facade. He realized, with a painful clarity, that his offer, which had been designed as a means to an end, a ruthless transaction to erase debt and secure his financial empire, had unexpectedly ignited in him a longing for something far more genuine. The sensation was disconcerting. For a man who had built his reputation on unyielding control, the memory of Callista's gentle defiance and unspoken pain threatened to unravel him. By mid-morning, fate, or perhaps necessity, drew them together once more. A brief, coordinated phone call arranged by a mutual acquaintance led Callista to a quiet corner of a luxurious hotel lounge, where the atmosphere was subdued, almost reflective. There, amid the soft hum of conversation and the gentle clink of silverware, Blaze awaited her. His expression was serious, his eyes searching hers as if he could gauge the depth of her turmoil from the faint tremor in her smile. They exchanged few words at first, the silence was laden with the gravity of their unspoken understanding. Finally, Blaze broke the quiet with a measured, almost hesitant, confession. Callista, last night was not just an act of desperation on my part, it stirred something in me that I never thought possible. His words, though simple, carried the weight of revelations he had long buried under corporate coldness. Callista's own voice trembled as she replied, I, too, felt something, unexpected, despite the contract, despite everything. But I am terrified that this was all just a cruel bargain, that I might be nothing more than a pawn in a game I never chose. Her gaze, steady yet filled with vulnerability, met his as if to challenge him to reveal the truth behind his facade. For a long moment, they sat there, their hearts pounding in quiet synchrony. In that charged atmosphere, the relentless pressures of debt, duty, and despair seemed to melt away, replaced by an unspoken promise that perhaps, amid the cruelty of the world, they could forge something real. Their conversation deepened as they discussed the night's events, the half-remembered caresses and the awkward smiles that had, against all odds, kindled a glimmer of warmth in the cold corridors of obligation. Blaze spoke of his lifelong isolation behind the rigid walls of his empire, of the loneliness that gnawed at him even as he commanded vast wealth. Callista recounted the daily battles against the crushing tide of creditors, the desperate nights spent wondering if her dreams of art and beauty would ever see the light of day. In their shared confessions, the gulf between them narrowed until they found themselves not as a billionaire and a debtor, but as two wounded souls seeking refuge in one another. As the morning wore on, the conversation took on a tentative tone of hope mingled with the fear of the unknown. Callista admitted that, despite the desperate nature of Blaze's proposition, she felt that the connection they had forged in that brief, fateful night might offer a glimmer of redemption, a way to heal not only her financial wounds but also the deeper, more invisible scars of loneliness. Blaze, his normally impassive demeanor softened by the raw honesty in her voice, vowed to protect her, not just from the relentless clutches of debt, but from any further exploitation of their situation. I promise you, Callista, he murmured, his voice both tender and resolute, that I will do everything in my power to ensure that what happened between us is not just a transaction, but the start of something that we can build together, if you're willing to take that chance. The weight of his words settled between them like a fragile glass ornament, beautiful yet easily shattered by harsh realities. In that moment, the stark contrast of their worlds, the opulent, high-powered universe of Blaze and the humble, art-stained life of Callista, seemed to blur into insignificance. All that remained was the raw, pulsating hope of a connection that defied logic, a promise that perhaps fate had delivered them into each other's arms for a reason. As the morning gave way to a quiet afternoon, their parting was bittersweet. They agreed to meet again, to continue unraveling the tangled threads of their union and to see if the fragile promise they had discovered might grow into something enduring. Walking out of the lounge, Callista felt both the burden of her choice and the stirring of a new possibility, a possibility that, despite the cruel terms of their initial bargain, might one day bloom into a love that could defy even the darkest of circumstances. And as the city continued its indifferent rhythm outside, the echoes of their shared morning lingered in the silence, a testament to the unexpected ways in which hope can emerge from the most desperate of bargains. Callista's heart still pounded with the residue of raw emotion as the afternoon light waned into a gentle, melancholic dusk. In the quiet sanctuary of her modest studio, its walls adorned with canvases in various stages of completion and scattered with the remnants of her creative bursts, she found herself unable to escape the memories of the previous night. Every brushstroke on her unfinished painting, every muted hue, carried with it the echo of Blaze Hawthorne's touch and the unspoken vulnerability that had emerged in the dark, opulent confines of his suite. That night, as she lay awake in the thin glow of a single desk lamp, Callista's thoughts swirled around the startling proposition and the inexplicable tenderness that had crept in between them, challenging everything she believed about herself and her future. Unable to bear the solitude of her thoughts any longer, Callista decided to meet Blaze in person that evening. She sent him a brief message, suggesting they convene at a quiet, secluded courtyard within the resort, a place where the din of the gala and the corporate bustle would be replaced by the soothing murmur of a gently flowing fountain and the rustle of evening breezes through ancient oak trees. Blaze agreed, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, amber shadows over the manicured lawns, they found themselves alone in the cool embrace of the courtyard. Sitting on a stone bench beneath a canopy of twinkling fairy lights, they faced each other with a tentative mixture of apprehension and hope. The air between them was filled with the gentle sound of water cascading from the fountain, and for a long, silent moment, neither dared to break the fragile stillness. Finally, Blaze cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. "Callista," he began, "I've been thinking about everything, the deal, our wedding night, and the way I felt when I looked at you this morning. I know what I offered you was as shocking as it was desperate, but I never expected to feel this way afterwards." His eyes, normally so guarded and cold in the boardroom, now shone with an unexpected warmth, a vulnerability that belied his notorious reputation. Callista's eyes searched his, and though her heart pounded with residual fear, she also saw there a glimmer of sincerity. "Blaze, last night was a maelstrom of contradictions," she replied slowly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Part of me feels utterly trapped by the deal, the debt that was supposed to be erased in exchange for something as personal as a child, and yet, amidst all that chaos, I felt, if only for a moment, cherished. I can't tell if it was the thrill of liberation from my debts or something deeper, something real. I'm scared, and I'm angry at myself for even considering it, but I can't deny that something in me stirred that night." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers, as if he was afraid to touch her too roughly. "I understand," he murmured. "I've built my life on calculated moves, on numbers and contracts, but that night, when I saw you, when I held you, it shattered parts of me I thought were long dead. I've always been alone in my pursuits, even surrounded by millions. Yet with you, I felt a connection that was both terrifying and incredibly precious. I know I came across as ruthless, and I know my proposal was abhorrent in many ways, but please believe me when I say that nothing about that night was meant to hurt you. I wanted to free you from your past, but in doing so, I fear I might have ensnared you in my world." The soft sound of a distant piano from the indoor lounge punctuated the gravity of his words. Callista swallowed, her gaze falling to the damp ground beneath the bench. "I'm not sure I can ever forget the fear I felt," the fear that I was just a means to an end, a solution to my own ruin. But at the same time, when you touched me and spoke to me, I felt seen. And she paused, the air thick with unshed tears, I'm afraid of losing that feeling, even if it's complicated. Blaze's hand finally moved, gently covering hers. Callista, I don't expect you to decide anything right now, he said softly. I'm not asking for an immediate commitment beyond what we agreed to. I only ask that we keep talking, truly talking, about what we both want. We can work through this, step by step. I promise you that I won't let this deal become a prison. I want to be more than a solution to your debts, and I want you to be more than a desperate choice for me. Their eyes locked in a silent exchange, the cacophony of the outside world receding until there was nothing left but the sound of their own breathing and the gentle murmur of water. In that ephemeral space, the weight of their pasts, the uncertainty of their present, and the promise of a future yet uncharted coalesced into a fragile, almost tangible hope. Callista felt that perhaps, against all odds, their shared vulnerability might be the seed from which something real could grow, a love that, despite its inception in desperation, might one day transcend the confines of a cruel bargain. They spent the remainder of the evening sharing memories, fears, and tentative dreams, their conversation meandering from the painful struggles of their daily lives to the inexplicable moments of beauty that had emerged from the darkness. With each word, the walls that had once separated their very different worlds began to crumble. Although the specter of the deal still loomed over them, a constant reminder of the price of their salvation, they both sensed that the connection forged in that fateful night had irrevocably changed them. As the stars emerged one by one in the clear night sky above, Callista and Blaze parted with no definitive answers but with a shared resolve to explore this new territory together. In the silence that followed, beneath the gentle glow of the moon, they vowed to uncover not only the truth behind the twisted arrangement that had bound them but also the possibility of a future defined by their own choices, one where love might conquer despair, and where hope could bloom even in the most unlikely of circumstances. Callista's world had shifted dramatically since that fateful wedding night, a night that had bound her to Blaze in ways she had never anticipated. Now, in the days that followed, the initial rush of passion and uncertainty had given way to a simmering conflict between her desire for freedom and a reluctant attachment that had crept into her heart. As she returned to her art studio, a cramped but cherished sanctuary filled with unfinished canvases and paint-splattered floors, she found herself haunted by vivid memories of that night. The gentle brush of Blaze's hand, his soft-spoken apologies, and the tender vulnerability in his eyes mingled with the bitter sting of the deal that had promised salvation but threatened to enslave her in ways she could not fully articulate. In the early hours of one particularly heavy afternoon, Callista sat before a blank canvas, her paintbrush trembling in her grasp. She had resolved that day to confront the tumult within her, a desire to reconcile the pragmatism of her desperate bargain with the unexpected warmth that had taken root between them. With each measured stroke, she poured her emotions onto the canvas, swirling shades of deep indigo mixed with splashes of passionate crimson, punctuated by streaks of hopeful gold. The painting became a living diary, an abstract representation of her inner conflict, the crushing weight of debt and despair juxtaposed against a fragile, blossoming hope that perhaps, in the arms of Blaze, she could find a future worth fighting for. That evening, after a long day spent immersed in her art and the quiet contemplation of her memories, Callista prepared to meet Blaze once again. The arrangement was to be discreet, a late dinner in the quiet private dining room of a boutique restaurant near the resort. As twilight bled into the darkening sky, she found herself trembling with anticipation and fear. Every step toward the restaurant was heavy with the memories of their first, desperate bargain and the gentle intimacy that had followed. Inside the restaurant, dimly lit with soft candlelight and a hushed murmur of classical music, Blaze waited at a table tucked away in a secluded corner. His normally impeccable demeanor now carried a hint of exhaustion and uncertainty. When Callista arrived, their eyes met, a silent exchange loaded with questions neither dared voice. For a long moment, they sat in silence as if measuring the distance between the pragmatic cruelty of their deal and the unpredictable warmth that had begun to bridge the gap between them. Blaze was the first to break the silence. Callista, he said, his voice low and earnest, these past few days have been filled with contradictions. I find myself torn between the logic of our agreement and the reality of what I feel when I'm with you. His gaze dropped, searching the table as if the answer might be hidden in the fine print of their contract. I never intended to hurt you or to bind you to me in a way that would rob you of your freedom. And yet, I can't ignore the truth that I've come to value you far beyond what was agreed upon. Callista's heart pounded as she considered his words. I feel the same, Blaze, she admitted, her voice trembling with both defiance and vulnerability. Every moment with you feels like a glimpse of something I never thought possible, a future not defined solely by debt and desperation, but by hope and genuine connection. But at the same time, I'm terrified. Terrified that if I let myself fall for you, I might lose everything that little of me I still have left. Their conversation deepened as the hours wore on. Over a carefully arranged dinner, they dissected their fears and desires, their voices rising and falling in a delicate cadence that balanced reason with raw emotion. Blaze confessed that the cold, calculated persona he had built around himself was beginning to crack under the weight of his loneliness, that the contract, originally nothing more than a tool to erase his business rival's threat, had unexpectedly opened his heart. Callista, in turn, spoke of the daily battles she fought against the crushing tide of debt and despair, and how, for the first time, she dared to imagine a future where love might replace the constant anxiety of financial ruin. As they spoke, the restaurant's ambient light seemed to grow warmer, as if reflecting the slow thawing of their guarded hearts. Yet the conversation was not without its shadows. Callista's eyes sometimes drifted to the small, leather-bound folder containing the signed contract, a stark reminder of the deal that had forced their union upon them. Every time I see this, she murmured, I'm reminded that none of this was entirely by our own choosing. I wonder if I'm only here because I was desperate, or if something real has grown between us. Blaze reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. I don't have an easy answer, he replied, his voice soft but resolute. All I know is that I can't ignore the connection that has blossomed. I want to protect you and allow you to have the freedom you deserve. And his words faltered, as if caught between the desire to commit and the fear of destroying what little hope they had. I want to build something with you that's not dictated by a contract. I want us to decide our own future, regardless of the circumstances that brought us together. The weight of his words settled over Callista like a warm blanket, mingling with the residual tension of past fears and the newfound hope that dared to bloom in her chest. That night, as they parted with a promise to speak again soon, Callista felt a bittersweet pang, a mixture of liberation from her old life and the dawning realization that the choice before her was no longer merely about escaping debt, but about embracing the possibility of love that might come with its own risks. In the quiet of the night, as she walked home under a starlit sky, she wondered if, in the delicate interplay of light and shadow, she had finally discovered a path toward a future that was entirely her own, a future where the scars of her past could give way to the tender promise of a new beginning. Callista spent the next several days submerged in an unyielding tide of revelations and mounting tension. By the time evening arrived, she had transformed her modest art studio into a command center of scattered bank statements, hastily photocopied invoices, and a jumble of emails printed in meticulous detail. Every irregular deposit, every transaction from shadowy shell companies, had been scrutinized and cross-referenced. The evidence now pointed to a far more sinister agenda than either of them had ever imagined, a labyrinthine conspiracy orchestrated by Brandon Keyes, a rival executive known for his ruthless ambition and bitter vendettas. That afternoon, while Callista sat hunched over her desk in the cramped back office of the studio, the relentless hum of the city outside mingled with the soft clicking of her keyboard as she pieced together the trail. One email, in particular, had shattered any lingering hope that this could be a mere accident. Signed by someone using the alias Raina Gray, the message outlined a detailed plan. It mentioned falsified hotel records, a deliberately corrupted surveillance feed, and even a directive to use a forger to produce a binding marriage certificate. The language was cold, precise, a business memo masquerading as a nefarious plot. It was clear that Keyes had set his sights on using Callista's vulnerable state as a pawn in a larger scheme aimed directly at undermining Blaze Hawthorne's corporate standing. As the rain outside finally let up and the late afternoon light softened, Callista's phone vibrated with an incoming call. She answered it hesitantly, and Blaze's voice came through, low and measured but laden with urgency. "Callista, my team just confirmed something crucial," he said. "They've traced multiple financial transfers and discovered that Keyes had funneled a substantial sum to an account linked to the intermediary behind Raina Gray. In essence, Keyes financed the entire operation to force our union, and the numbers don't lie. The sum involved isn't trivial, it's enough to shake the foundations of a minor corporate merger I was about to finalize." Callista's breath caught. The revelation was staggering. "So, you mean, this was all planned to humiliate you? To create a scandal that would weaken your position?" she asked, her voice barely concealing a mix of indignation and disbelief. "Yes," Blaze replied, his tone grim. "Keyes wanted to paint me as distracted, as someone who'd let personal matters derail business. By forcing a marriage, he aimed to create a media frenzy and distract my board at a critical juncture. I can't imagine a more personal form of sabotage. And now, seeing the evidence laid out in stark detail, I realize that neither of us is truly at fault here. We were both caught in a scheme that was designed to tear down my empire, and to use your desperation as the lever." His pause was heavy with unspoken regret. "I'm furious, Callista. I have every intention of taking legal action, of exposing Keyes for the manipulative coward he is." The conversation lingered in the air as Callista looked down at the documents spread before her. In those pages, the cold mathematics of corporate betrayal met the raw emotions of her own life, bills, hopelessness, and the desperate longing for something more than a cycle of poverty and despair. But amid the anger and heartache, a surprising, gentle warmth had begun to grow between her and Blaze. Their secret meetings had evolved from cautious inquiries into a bond that transcended the original, desperate bargain. Now, with the true extent of the conspiracy coming into focus, the stakes were higher than ever, not just for Blaze's empire, but for the fragile connection that had unexpectedly bloomed between them. Late that evening, Callista found herself wandering the quiet halls of her studio, the only light coming from a solitary desk lamp. Her mind swirled with thoughts of what this conspiracy meant for her future. She recalled the moments of unguarded tenderness they had shared, the way Blaze's eyes softened when he spoke of isolation and loss, the manner in which his touch had lingered longer than necessary. Those small gestures, previously dismissed as anomalies in a transaction, now shone with a possibility that was both dangerous and undeniably human. In a moment of resolve, Callista decided to compile every shred of evidence she could find. She began by sorting through the bank statements and receipts once more, meticulously noting every irregularity. Late into the night, she even dug through old emails and text messages, searching for any hint of a connection between her, Blaze, and the enigmatic Raina Gray. With each discovery, the unauthorized withdrawals, the payments from unknown sources, the timing that corresponded with the fateful night, the picture grew more complex. It wasn't merely a case of a desperate woman accepting help, it was a carefully engineered ploy, a diversion crafted to hurt Blaze in the most personal way possible. The next morning, after a restless sleep filled with vivid dreams of faceless bureaucrats and shadowy figures, Callista met with one of her most trusted advisors, a wiry, sharp-eyed accountant who had worked with her through the worst of her financial troubles. In a cramped coffee shop near her studio, she laid out the evidence. The advisor's eyes widened as he scanned the documents. "This is beyond standard fraud," he whispered. "Someone's been manipulating not just your accounts but creating an entire narrative here. And if Keyes is behind it, then he's not just targeting your debt, he's aiming for a total collapse of trust, both personally and corporately." The weight of his words pressed heavily on Callista's heart, but also steeled her resolve. She would not let herself be a pawn, no matter how desperate her circumstances. At the same time, Blaze was doubling down on his own investigation. In his sleek penthouse office, amidst rows of glowing computer screens and stacks of legal briefs, he met with his chief investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Livia. Together, they dissected every communication, every financial transfer, and every manipulated hotel record that had led to his forced union with Callista. The evidence was overwhelming, pointing to a deliberate, cold-blooded strategy orchestrated by Brandon Keyes. It appears, Livia reported, that Keyes viewed this as an opportunity to undermine you at a critical merger. The marriage wasn't just a distraction, it was a calculated assault on your credibility. Blaze's eyes flashed with fury, and for a moment, the polished veneer of the billionaire cracked to reveal a man deeply wounded by betrayal. "We'll expose him," he vowed. "And I'll make sure that you, Callista, are never used as a pawn again." That promise, spoken in the quiet chaos of late-night investigations and the cold glow of digital evidence, resonated deeply with Callista. It was a promise not only of justice but of protection, a promise that, despite the darkness of the conspiracy, there was now a partner who truly cared for her well-being. As the hours stretched on, Callista and Blaze maintained their secret communications, exchanging findings and strategies in hushed, encrypted messages. With every new piece of evidence, the foundation of Keyes's plan crumbled further, even as it threatened to shatter the remnants of their old lives. By the end of that harrowing day, Callista sat alone in her studio once more, surrounded by the tools of her art and the tangible proof of a conspiracy that had invaded every corner of her existence. Though fear still gnawed at her, a fierce determination had taken root, a determination to fight back against those who would manipulate her fate. And as she looked out the rain-streaked window, watching the city slowly awaken to a new day, she resolved that she would confront this hidden agenda head-on. Whether that meant severing the contract with Blaze or embracing the uncertain possibility of a future together, one thing was clear: she would no longer allow herself to be used as a stepping stone in someone else's vendetta. In that moment, amid the quiet hum of her studio and the persistent drip of the last raindrops, Callista's eyes burned with resolve. The conspiracy was unfolding, the enemy was identified, and though the path ahead was fraught with peril, she knew that with Blaze by her side, and with the truth as her ally, they would reclaim control over their lives. The stakes were higher than ever, and the battle for freedom had truly begun. Callista's pulse thundered as she made her way to the private meeting room deep within the resort, a secluded space with thick, soundproof walls and a single, dim lamp that cast long, somber shadows across a large oak table. The air was heavy with anticipation and a sense of impending confrontation. Blaze had arranged for this meeting as soon as the latest wave of evidence had come in, and both he and Callista knew that tonight could change everything. They had spent the past several days gathering damning documents and piecing together encrypted messages that implicated Brandon Keyes in a meticulously orchestrated scheme. Now, with the full weight of the conspiracy pressing down on them, they prepared to confront the truth and decide how to move forward. Blaze arrived first, his usually impeccable posture betraying a trace of weariness. He sat silently, his eyes fixed on a neat stack of papers before him, a collection of emails, bank records, and witness statements that told a story of calculated betrayal. Callista entered a few moments later, her face etched with determination and sorrow. As the door closed softly behind her, she took a deep breath and joined him at the table. For a long moment, neither spoke, their shared silence speaking volumes about the internal battles each was waging. Finally, Blaze broke the quiet, his voice low and measured. "Callista, everything we've uncovered points to one man, Brandon Keyes. He planned every detail, from the forged marriage certificate to the corrupted surveillance footage, with one purpose: to humiliate me and weaken my position in the merger negotiations. But it's more than that. Keyes wanted to use our union as a diversion, a tool to discredit me in the eyes of my board and investors." Callista's eyes narrowed as she sifted through the papers. "I can't believe that someone would go to such lengths, not only to destabilize your empire but to use me as the scapegoat in his vendetta. It makes me feel, exploited, as if I were nothing more than a pawn in his ruthless game." Her voice trembled between anger and sadness, and as she spoke, she recalled the countless nights of fear, of wondering if she'd ever regain control over her own destiny. "I always thought I was fighting for my art, for my dignity. Now I see that I was also fighting against forces far beyond my control. Blaze reached out, placing his hand gently over hers. Callista, I know how unfair this is. I've spent my entire life building something, an empire, a legacy, only to have it threatened by someone who cared nothing for truth or honor. And I'm angry, not just at Keys, but at the system that allowed him to manipulate everything so precisely. But in all this chaos, I've come to realize that my life doesn't have to be defined solely by corporate warfare. You've shown me that there's more at stake than balance sheets and power plays. I've grown to care for you deeply, even if our union was forced upon us by circumstances we never chose. Callista's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she squeezed his hand in silent reassurance. I, too, have discovered something unexpected, she whispered. In the midst of despair, your presence has given me hope, a spark of something real. But we can't ignore the fact that our lives have been manipulated, that our choices were not entirely our own. We must reclaim that freedom, not just for our own sakes, but for the integrity of everything we hold dear. They spent hours dissecting every piece of evidence. Blaze's legal team had confirmed that the money funneled to Key's shell companies was staggering, a deliberate attempt to finance a fraud of epic proportions. Callista recounted how she had begun noticing strange, unexplained charges on her accounts weeks before their fateful meeting, a pattern that had ultimately led to her desperation. Together, they wove the disparate threads into a tapestry of betrayal, an intricate plan that involved bribing hotel staff, forging official documents, and even hacking into security systems to erase any trace of their true actions. Every revelation cut deeper than the last, exposing not just the technicalities of Key's scheme, but the profound cruelty of a man who would use another's vulnerability to further his own ambitions. As the meeting wore on, the room grew darker and the weight of their shared burden pressed in like the encroaching night. Blaze leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Callista, I want you to understand something. None of these deceptions, defines who we are. We were thrust into this nightmare, but we have the power to break free. I refuse to let Keys, or anyone, control my life, or use you as a weapon against me. We will expose him, take him down in court, and restore what he's tried to steal from us, our dignity, our freedom, and the chance for a future that we choose ourselves. Tears welled in Callista's eyes as she nodded slowly, her heart swelling with a mix of sorrow and fierce resolve. I promise, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it, I will fight every step of the way. I won't let this experience rob me of who I am, and I won't let it define our future. We'll stand together, no matter how high the stakes. Outside the sealed room, the distant sounds of the resort's evening festivities continued unabated, a stark contrast to the intensity of the confrontation within. In that moment, Callista and Blaze forged an unbreakable alliance, a promise to defy the machinations of a bitter rival and reclaim control over their own destinies. The revelations had transformed their relationship from one of desperation and obligation into a genuine partnership rooted in shared pain and the hope of redemption. As they gathered the final documents and prepared to send their evidence to the district attorney, the air between them was thick with anticipation. They knew that the road ahead would be treacherous, that Keys might fight back with every resource at his disposal. And yet, the determination in their voices and the steadfast grip of their intertwined hands conveyed a singular truth: together, they were stronger than any enemy, stronger than any scheme designed to tear them apart. In the quiet aftermath of their meeting, as the first stars began to prick the darkening sky outside, Callista and Blaze sat in reflective silence. Every heartbeat resonated with the promise of resistance and renewal, echoing the sentiment that their lives, though marred by manipulation, could still be redefined by their own choices. In that sealed room, amid scattered evidence and shared confessions, they vowed to expose the hidden agenda that had forced them into an unwanted union, and to reclaim the freedom that was rightfully theirs. Their struggle was far from over, but in that moment, they embraced the certainty that no matter how tangled the web of deceit might be, their alliance would be the beacon that guided them toward a future built on truth, love, and unwavering determination. On the night of Valentine's Day, the air at Palm Crest Resort seemed to vibrate with a strange blend of opulence and raw vulnerability. As twilight deepened into a velvety darkness punctuated by the shimmer of distant city lights, Callista Mercer and Blaze Hawthorne prepared to step into a future that neither had ever truly imagined. The grand ballroom, draped in lush roses and soft, flickering candlelight, was packed with the crème de la crème of Atlanta's elite, business magnates, renowned philanthropists, and glittering socialites, all gathered for a charity gala that promised to be the pinnacle of the season. Yet amid the extravagant decor and the effervescent buzz of polite conversation, a deeper, more personal drama was about to unfold. Blaze had taken the stage with a calm authority that belied the storm raging within him, his voice resonant and measured as he addressed the assembled guests. "Tonight," he began, pausing as if to let the weight of his words settle, "I stand before you not only as a leader in my field but as a man who has been forced into circumstances beyond his control, and who has, against all odds, discovered something unexpectedly beautiful." His eyes scanned the room, and as they fell upon Callista, a hush seemed to fall over the crowd. For a moment, time appeared to slow, every face, every flashing camera, faded into the background, leaving only the unspoken truth that connected them. Callista watched from the side of the stage, her heart a tumult of emotions. Here she was, a woman whose life had been defined by desperation and hardship, now thrust into a spotlight she never desired, all because of a deal that had promised financial salvation in exchange for a future she had never chosen. But as Blaze continued his address, detailing in carefully chosen words the deceptions that had manipulated their fates and the courage it had taken to rise above them, something within her stirred. His words, raw and unguarded, spoke of a vulnerability that transcended the cold calculations of business, a revelation that his soul had been touched by her very presence. "I have learned," he said, his voice softening further, "that what was once an instrument of control can become a beacon of hope. What began as a desperate bargain has evolved into a connection I can no longer ignore." The applause that erupted was not merely a response to a scandal laid bare or corporate injustice exposed, it was a celebration of human resilience, a recognition that even in the midst of elaborate schemes and shattered lives, genuine love could find its way. With deliberate grace, Blaze stepped down from the podium and moved toward the edge of the stage where Callista stood. In that charged moment, the distance between them evaporated. They embraced amid a sea of flashing cameras and awestruck murmurs, their closeness symbolizing not only the dissolution of a forced arrangement but the birth of something profoundly real. After the formal program, the gala transitioned into a more relaxed affair, with guests mingling in intimate clusters beneath the soft glow of chandeliers and amidst elegantly arranged floral displays. In a quiet alcove off the main hall, away from the prying eyes of the press, Blaze and Callista found a moment of solitude. The room, bathed in the gentle light of a single crystal lamp and the soft murmur of a live jazz quartet in the background, became their private sanctuary, a temporary escape from the overwhelming spectacle of the evening. Sitting close together on a set of plush velvet chairs, they spoke in hushed tones about the tumultuous journey that had led them to this point. Blaze recounted the bitter betrayal orchestrated by his rival, Brandon Keyes, a revelation that had shattered his carefully constructed facade and forced him to confront a reality where his empire could be toppled by the manipulation of personal lives. Callista, her eyes reflecting both the scars of her past and a tentative hope for the future, spoke of the long, lonely nights spent worrying over mounting debts and the desperate choices that had nearly extinguished her creative spirit. They recalled the early days, the awkward silence, the hesitant touch, the shared glances that had gradually dissolved into something more. In that intimate space, their conversation wove between confessions of vulnerability and declarations of resolve. They agreed that the forced contract, though legally binding and born of desperate necessity, no longer defined them. Instead, it had become the catalyst for an unforeseen transformation, a painful but beautiful metamorphosis that allowed them to rediscover parts of themselves long buried beneath the pressures of society. As the night wore on, the couple stepped out onto a private balcony that overlooked the resort's illuminated gardens. The cool night air mingled with the delicate scent of roses and the soft strains of a distant piano. Here, under the vast, star-studded sky, they allowed themselves a rare moment of unfiltered hope. Blaze took Callista's hand, his touch gentle and affirming. "Callista," he murmured, "I know that our journey began under the most unimaginable of circumstances. I never intended for my proposal to be a transaction, a mere escape from my burdens. Instead, I discovered in you a light I thought I'd lost forever." His voice trembled with a sincerity that spoke to every corner of his guarded heart. "I want to build a future with you, one that is not dictated by debt or deceit, but by our own choices. I promise to protect you, to fight for our freedom, and to ensure that our love is our own, free from the manipulations of those who sought to use us." Callista's eyes filled with tears as she listened, the raw emotion in his words resonating deeply within her. "I, too, have been broken by the cruelty of my circumstances," she whispered. "I have lived in fear of losing myself to despair, of being defined by my debts and my past. But with you, I feel that there is a possibility, a chance to heal, to rebuild, and to finally embrace a future filled with love and dignity." Her voice wavered, yet there was a resolute strength in her words. "I want to believe that our union, though it began as a desperate bargain, can evolve into something genuine. I want to choose my own destiny, and I want you by my side as we rewrite our story." Their conversation lingered in the stillness of the balcony, the silence punctuated only by the distant hum of the city and the soft rustle of leaves in the night breeze. In that moment, the complexities of their past, the financial chains, the forced contract, the malicious schemes, faded into the background, replaced by the tender promise of a new beginning. Together, they vowed to confront the challenges ahead, to expose the corruption that had once sought to tear them apart, and to reclaim the freedom that was rightfully theirs. They knew the road would be fraught with obstacles, legal battles, media scrutiny, and the ever-looming threat of Brandon Keyes's revenge. Yet, as they stood hand in hand under the canopy of a starry sky, both Blaze and Callista felt a quiet certainty that, together, they could overcome any adversity. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and lavender, Blaze and Callista re-entered the ballroom. The gala had reached its peak of celebratory fervor, but the memory of their private moments lingered like a sacred secret between them. They moved through the crowd with a new sense of purpose, their bond now an unspoken testament to the power of resilience and the unexpected ways in which love can flourish in even the darkest of circumstances. Amid the clamor of applause and the flash of cameras, they exchanged knowing glances, a promise that, regardless of what the future held, they would face it together. And in that unforgettable Valentine's night, as hearts beat in unison and hope surged like a rising tide, their story transformed from one of desperate deals and manipulated fates into a radiant declaration of love, a love that was as shocking as it was genuine, and a future that, despite its uncertain beginnings, promised to be written on their own terms.